G'day everyone, this is Greg Ryan. Welcome to Rare and Resilient, 1 in 5,000 podcasts, episode 14. And today we are joined by an IAARM dad, Mark from America. And Mark is the father of Eastern Sky, who is 3.5 years old. And welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Thanks, Greg. It's good to be here.
Okay, mate. Now, most of the time we talk to pet mothers, and it's very rare we've had an occasional father, but this time we're going to have just a one-on-one chat to you as a father of an IAARM child. Can you take us back to when Eastern Sky was first born and what you and your wife Holly, your thoughts and how you dealt with it at the time?
So leading up to his birth, we knew that he had one kidney. One was severely underdeveloped, so we knew that it was likely going to be one kidney, but that was all we knew going into the birth. So when he was initially born, we didn't really notice anything that was different, and he was immediately swaddled following his birth. And so it wasn't for a few hours that a nurse came in to change his diaper, and then kind of made this expression that makes you wonder as a parent what's going on. A couple hours later, we were traveling to another higher level NICU here in the States, at least.
So it wasn't identified straight away at birth when they did they're supposed to do all the inspections of the child.
It's funny because I remember I was taking photos of him, and I was thinking, like, is that off, or is that different than what I was expecting? But honestly, at the time, there was so much going on that I didn't really think much of it. Hadn't really been around super new newborns, so I had no idea what I was really even looking for.
Where did you have to travel to? How far to the other hospital?
It was about 30 minutes from us, and that was it was a really, really tough drive. So obviously Holly had just given birth, and they were not going to be able to, obviously it's hard sometimes having these discussions without bringing in the American healthcare system to some extent, but we would have to discharge her from the current hospital. She didn't have a complicated delivery per se, but there's always risks. And then she would have had to have been admitted at the other hospital, because they had both a children's area and a women's hospital. And obviously she didn't want to do that because she was concerned about being separated from him. I talked to her and said, look, he was transported by, I guess there's a neonatal ambulance that they can send. And so that's what he was transported by. And so I told her we should stay and try to sleep a few hours before we went over there, because there was really nothing to do. And obviously at that point, we were also still busy searching on our phones to understand Factual and all the other things that might entail, because frankly, the medical staff there were not super forthcoming. Either they didn't know, or they had other things going on. So we were kind of left to try to research and understand that ourselves.
It would have been scary going through Dr. Google.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, it's not such a common set of challenges that you would find lots of conspiracy theory type stuff on the internet. That's not really the case. But there wasn't a lot of information about if you start at point A, how do you get to point C? Because obviously one of the things that we've learned is there is no sort of end state, right? I think for most people, because there are varying degrees of severity, there's not going to be a single solution. And so one of the things that struck me as this journey unfolded was every time we thought we had figured out the thing that was going to keep us up at night, then there was another thing. We originally thought it was going to be a single kidney, and then obviously having imperforate anus with the bladder neck fistula was challenging. And then we found out later that he had a neurogenic bladder. And honestly, that one was the one I think that caused us the most trouble in the near term. Obviously the colorectal stuff takes a lot of time and effort as well, but the bladder stuff was very challenging to find specialists.
Yeah. And how long did he spend at the other hospital before you were discharged and you could take him home?
He was in the NICU for, I want to say a little over 2 weeks. Overall, actually, he did, I think, pretty well. As far as the roll of the dice is concerned, the surgeon that did his ostomy surgery, by all accounts, did a very good job. We took him to Cincinnati Children's and Columbus Children's and a couple other places that had colorectal centers, and everyone said that portion of the procedure looked pretty solid. So that was kind of lucky, because one of the things that we've certainly heard from other parents is that, and probably more for pull through and other things, but that different surgical interventions may not have been done correctly by a surgeon who was not as experienced, and so ultimately there needed to be additional work to kind of correct that.
Yeah. And how did you handle the initial change in the stoma bags and plus I'd imagine dealing with the bladder issue, it would have been very full on to start with.
So we'll talk about those as two different elements. For anybody that might be listening that has a newborn with the ostomy bag stuff, I mean, that is challenging for sure. And that was definitely a source of frustration sometimes, because he was very small. He was only about a month preemie, but he was about just shy of 6 pounds. But so the bag and the site was really, really small. And we actually found this video on YouTube where this lady had, she'd been using like a hair dryer to dry the area post like bath. And some of the things like that actually proved really useful to us to be able to understand a little bit more about those, the interlocking mechanisms that you can get for these different types of bags and the different adhesives, and experimenting with different kinds of powders and things to try to get that right. Once we got into a system, I mean, you would get into a situation where, Murphy's Law would intervene, and you'd try to go on like a day trip somewhere, and the bag would, you'd have 2 bags fail on you. But largely that was not too bad. I think if I look across the last 3 years, that had its moments of frustration, but it was fairly manageable. The thing that created the most trouble for us that we didn't really understand was the bladder issues. So he had a test for reflux done when he was born, and they did not detect any reflux. So the first few months after he was born, he was waking a lot at night, like 8, 9, 10 times a night. And we would talk to different pediatricians, and there was a urologist that we worked with in the Washington DC area, and everybody was like, oh, some kids are fussy. And obviously my wife felt like there was something more going on. I certainly felt that way as well. And you would think when kids present with more complicated medical histories that there would be a little bit more consideration there, but not so much. And in hindsight, I do feel really frustrated with that particular urologist, because I felt like they had left us hanging. They really should have ordered another test for reflux. And when he presented with 8 UTIs across a 1-year span, they really should have taken a more active interest in getting that resolved. Ultimately, obviously, I think Holly reached out to you, or you found her on Twitter and pointed us to Dr. Alam, and that made a huge difference in terms of getting him back on track, at least with the bladder piece, because now he's sleeping much better once we've gotten some of those other issues out of the way.
Oh, that's great. How did you and Holly handle the dilations?
So we actually were in Dr. Levitt's study, which was to evaluate whether or not dilation was necessary to achieve certain outcomes. So, and I apologize if I'm misremembering the exact term, but there was, because I'm thinking of the beer, it's like there's like a Heineke procedure or something like that. Essentially, there was a modification that they did along with the pull through that essentially the hope was reduce the need to do dilations. So he was in the experimental group. There were no dilations.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And we
Yes.
literally picked a paper out of a hat. I remember the surgical attendant coming through with like a hat with different options. And he's like, what are you hoping to get? And I was like, look, man, I don't care. I just want him to have a good outcome. So not knowing what dilations entail, right? So I think now looking back, yeah, we got really lucky.
Recently, we just had Dr. Wood from Nationwide on the podcast, and he was talking about dilation study that they did at Nationwide, and that different families ended up going into different parts of it. So it's wonderful that you were part of that program and that you were with the surgical dilation side of things.
Yeah, I mean, he did our son's surgery for that one while Dr. Levitt was still at Nationwide. Now, obviously, he's out here on the East Coast. That was obviously one less thing that we had to worry about. Following that surgery, I believe the next thing that we were working on was his tethered spinal cord, which he also had.
And when was that discovered?
So, yeah, they supposedly they needed to do a radiological survey and see what the status of that was, but apparently there was a mix-up and they never did it, or if they did it, they lost the results. So we ended up having it done after his pull-through surgery, if I'm remembering correctly. He was already out, he was already anesthetized, and so that's when they realized, hey, there was some tension in the spinal cord itself, and they were going to need to do a detethering.
Oh, okay. So that was discovered when he went to Nationwide for the pull through and all that. It wasn't picked up from the initial hospital.
It's possible, again, that they did the study, but they just never. This is the other thing. A lot of these different hospitals are not using the same digital medical record systems. Some are using what's called Epic, and others are in other systems. And so we were very fortunate. The first, I guess, 2 years really after he was born, the company that I was working for was based in Massachusetts in the United States. And they typically mandate more things as part of their health insurance plans than other states in the country. And so a lot of our care that we needed for him was covered, with the exception of sort of the out-of-pocket or deductibles. But we were very I think I called him the $1 million baby for the first couple months, because when we looked through like the NICU bills and the first couple surgeries Nationwide, I mean, they do the what would you pay if you weren't insured, which clearly no one would be able to pay. But yeah, it was 7 figures, which was a surprise.
The American healthcare insurance system gets brought up a lot from someone coming from Australia. It's I just don't get it, and I'll never be able to get my head around that. What you guys have to, the hoops and all that you have to go through. Now, how did you get to the decision to go to one of the major colorectal centres after his initial surgery? So did you do the research, and that's what led you to go to Nationwide, or was it that you were recommended from the initial surgeon who did the colostomy? How did that all come about?
I want to say when we were looking at like Vactrol and some of the other cofactors that we were getting hits on Columbus and Cincinnati and Boston and a couple other places. I mean, I think we came across, Dr. Pena as well. And obviously he was pretty far away. So we were looking for something that was conceivably drivable, even if it was like a long day. We were both in a really good place in that we were working predominantly remotely, even though this was pre-pandemic. And so like I remember jumping on work calls from Ronald McDonald House in Columbus, Ohio, and sitting, in the parking lot during longer surgeries that I wasn't as nervous about, just in meetings, so that we could kind of keep working even if we needed to be somewhere else. And so that gave us the flexibility to say we're going to pursue care, kind of anywhere on the eastern half of the US where we feel like it's going to be as good as we can do, right? Yeah. As parents, I think that's that was a big stressor, right? That we would somehow do a disservice to him by rushing a decision, even though often the practitioners themselves are like, let's do this. Like, when do you want to do this? We'll get you scheduled. and you gotta pump the brakes a little bit. Say, well, do I feel like I understand all of the variables? I'm never gonna be a surgeon. I'm not gonna be a doctor, but my background is in cybersecurity, and so I always try to untangle complex problems. And so, they start saying, "Oh, we're just gonna do this, and then we're gonna do this," and then as you kind of move through the journey of somebody with Vactral, you start to realize there's a lot of complicating factors. A fistula is not just a fistula. Imperforate anus is not just imperforate anus. There's varying degrees and different outcomes. Stuff like the sacral ratio and all this like complicated mechanisms to try to assess like somebody's outcome. Even then, sometimes those just fall flat. We've been doing enemas in varying forms for the last year. And, I remember one of the things that they told us was, yeah, you do the boot camp thing, we find a formula that works, and that takes a couple weeks. Or, week 53, still figuring it out. He's done, an x-ray every week for like the last year. He's got like 50 x-rays under his belt. And, that's a little frustrating. He's had, he had a stricture, which looked like it came from the ostomy reversal. And so that was causing blockages for a while. It took a little while to figure that one out and get that resolved. There's always been like little things. I joked with some of my coworkers who knew parts of our son's medical journey, at least at the time. And I said, look, I feel like to some extent we were very well prepared for the pandemic, because at least here, the first few months of the pandemic was always like living week to week or month to month. And that's honestly what it felt like the first couple of years of our son's life. As we came out of the hospital, the NICU, thinking, oh, we've got this all figured out. We're just going to do these ostomy bags. And then we realized, oh, it's not quite what we assumed it would be. It's a little bit more complicated. And then, you find out more things. And so at some point we just stopped thinking we had it figured out. And instead we just said, okay, this is what we know, and we'll brace ourselves for what might come next and try to be a little bit more resilient, and get into, be as routine driven as you can, but expect the unexpected, and not to be not negative, right? But just more prepared.
I always say that to new parents when I talk to them or whatever, you just got to live in the moment.
Yeah, that's right. And so that proved to be really useful for the pandemic. Well, at least for the first 12 months, because we were able to kind of extend that mindset and to keep doing that.
Yeah.
Medical care during the pandemic has been very interesting, just because of we've had restrictions on who can go into the hospital, what procedures are allowed. I don't think we've run into a situation yet where he's had any care that we couldn't get in a timely manner. But that was always a fear. That was probably our main fear throughout the last year.
And this is the question that I really like to pursue with parents and that. How did you handle the emotional side of it as a father and seeing what Eastern Sky's been through? How's that impacted on you, and what's been your strategies to get through it all?
Yeah, it was really tough. He's our only child, so we didn't, for better or for worse, we had nothing to compare against. So I think that in some ways might have been good. It's funny because my wife and I were talking about this a couple of weeks ago, like, people talking about on different forums and places, feeling upset that their child was born with a condition that's limited them in some way. And I certainly have felt similar sentiments in the past, but I also think that, hopefully this is life defining, hopefully not in a way that limits him, but in a way that makes him more resilient in ways that many others are not. Obviously I'm still hoping that medicine can do a variety of things to make that path a little easier to walk. But I think so much of who he will become and who he will be is to some extent a product of that. I hope that he's able to take the best parts of that challenge, if that makes sense, developing empathy for others, and perhaps looking into how he can better help others with similar challenges as he grows up. I think a lot of the fears that I had early on, I was obviously very concerned in the first few months about, life expectancy and just so many other things. We're very fortunate that we're not talking about 100 years ago. So yeah, I think he is, a very curious, very tough kid, and I think that those are good qualities to have. And it's hard to say if those, to what extent, the nature versus nurture, how much of that is because of the circumstances around his upbringing, and how many of those are just sort of inherent. I think it's, it is intertwined kind of with who he is, and I think that's hopefully that's something he can be proud of to some extent, when he gets older.
Absolutely. And you say he still has the enemas, and he still, I'd imagine, gets cathed with his bladder. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
As he's got older, have you noticed any discernible change in how he handles that? And he's sort of like a bit more, he knows what's going to happen to some extent.
Yeah, I think, the interesting thing about BN3 is he doesn't understand at this point what's normal for other kids.
Correct.
He came home the other day, and there was a kid in his preschool class who's, potty training or potty trained. And he was like, oh, so and so was using the bathroom the other day all by herself, and like the teachers were saying, what good job that she did. And I think that's one of the concerns is that I have as a parent is how I'm going to frame, obviously along with Holly, that discussion around, yeah, we're celebrating that these kids are having successes. You're having successes of your own, whether you realize it or not. But they are different in some ways, and so he's going to be confused, I think, when he realizes other kids don't cath, and why that is the way that it is. But it's interesting. I was on social media the other day and ran across this guy who was a soldier and had been deployed to Iraq and had been hit with a bullet from a sniper. He was paralyzed as a result and has been back in the States for a number of years, and he's been in the medical device research field as a result of his injuries, being paralyzed, and so they've actually been doing a lot of work around catheters, because in the States, at least, it looks like there's a little over 1 million folks who, I guess it wouldn't necessarily all be neurogenic, but different challenges as it pertains to the bladder. And so they've got a device in phase 2 trials that will allow someone to sort of leave an indwelling catheter for 7 days. And this is for males specifically right now, based on the physiology and the way that the device would kind of be positioned. But the DoD is actually funding some of that research, and I think it's out at UCLA, and there's a couple other groups that are teamed up. But I think about something like that, and by the time he's a teen, I mean, it'll be out of FDA trials in the next year or two, assuming that there's no major issues. So the vision that I have of him, worried, is he going to have enough of the antiseptics and the lubricants and these catheters, and he's going to have to walk around like a backpack of this stuff. How does that work? How do you do sleepovers? I mean, a lot of that actually might be manageable in a different way than it even is now, and not just for him, but for a lot of other folks as well. Because we think about, I remember that one of the first conversations we had shortly after he was born, and as we started to understand some of the challenges, like, how's he going to do sleepovers? How's he going to do this? We want him to obviously be able to have the same experiences that we had as kids. And with medical advance, I mean, he's got a mini ACE, right? So he's doing enemas by way of a flush through his abdomen, which is obviously very different than doing it rectally, because I know that well, he had a stricture at the time, which was part of the problem, but that he did not have a good time with that, probably again because of the stricture as much as anything else. But with the mini ACE, that's made life a lot easier. And then something like an indwelling catheter that doesn't require changes 5 or 6 times a day, that would be a big change as well.
Did you notice a distinct change in him, like his behavior and his reaction when he went from the rectal enemas to the mini ACE?
So I do have a story I'll share. I apologize to him in advance if he hears this in like 15 years. But we were very, we had obviously we had all these ideas about like how things would go as we raised him, like, oh, no screens until he's like 20 and this and that. And of course, he was probably, I guess, 2 when we started doing the rectal enemas, and we were really struggling to keep him focused and not move around. Trying to put an ostomy bag on a little kid that's moving around, trying to do enemas on a little kid that's trying to move around. These are not easy things if they are worked up. And there's no amount of like coercion, and you can't really promise them like candy and things, because that's not going to solve the problem either. So we said, okay, we'll let him watch a show. And it's obviously very age appropriate programming. Like, thank goodness for Netflix. You can just stick all that stuff. But we weren't sure how well that was helping, because he was still having discomfort during the enemas. And after, I want to say, about a week of that, he wasn't saying a ton of words yet, maybe 30 or 40 words. But I was like, hey, buddy, do you want to watch a show or whatever? And we said, we got to get the enema started first. That was always the condition. And I remember he was laying there and he was like, put it in my bottom. He just started yelling. He's like, put it in my bottom. And I was like, well, my wife just like, and I just started cracking up. We're like, well, I guess it works. I mean, it's clearly not so bad that he doesn't want to go through it if he gets screen time out of it. So we were able to get those going, and like, but yeah, mini ACE is much easier. It's the logistics all around are just much better.
And at what age did he get that surgery?
That was early too. I guess that was actually done last. Pandemic has really thrown my recall back, but it's been within the last year that he had that done. I want to say it was probably in the spring of last year.
So he was around 2.5, which is fairly young for that.
Young, super young. Yeah. So Dr. Levitt did that procedure. Yes. And I recall he had mentioned that he had been working with the urologist as well, because they were looking at like, the option of vesicostomy and potentially doing this or both, or seeing what was going on with the appendix, because that's what they wanted to use. And so when they looked, they said, yeah, the size is sufficient to accommodate that, and we can move forward with it. Funny thing though is when I was talking with Levitt, he had this anecdote where he essentially conveyed that he had his appendix removed when he was younger, and I was like, oh, I see. This is your kind of campaign against the appendix, because your appendix tried to hurt you when you were younger, and now you've decided to seek your revenge. But honestly, if this is their revenge, it's really good. He did not have a ton of complications from it. I think we were super nervous when we had to change that tubing out the first time, but I think we gave him like a tiny square of chocolate and just negotiated the heck out of it. And he did give us like 30 seconds of just not moving and being quiet, which was all it took to get those swapped out. And then I was like, oh, that was way more fuss than, because we were just, he had, what did he have before? He had something else in prior to the mini ACE. And I remember that popped out and we couldn't get it back in. And we were like freaking out.
Oh, I was going to say, that'd be very scary.
It was a longer tube. And there was just more concern on our part that we were going to kind of like push that into the wrong spot. And so that, yeah, the mini ACE has been pretty easy.
How is he now? Like, I've seen photos on social media that Holly puts, and he seems to be very active and up and about all the time.
Yeah, he is super high energy. So I would say he's typical of the 3-year-old crowd. It's been hot and humid here lately, but when it's not, he wants to run around a lot outside. He wants to play on all the equipment. I mean, he is doing, I think, everything you would expect a kid in his age and development level to be doing, which is awesome to see as a parent. Obviously, that's very rewarding. Yeah.
Oh, and it's a credit to you and Holly, because I know the amount of time and travel you have put in to take Eastern Sky to different specialists to get the best care available and to find the answers that you were looking for. And it certainly has been a journey for the both of you, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it is. Yeah, it's half the time it's taking care of him, and the other half of the time it's sort of advocating on his behalf by way of, finding specialists or trying to understand how to overcome certain roadblocks that pop up during care, like, hey, why isn't this getting us the outcome we're looking for? What can we do? Are there any alternative approaches that we can take to get him to a good place? I think everybody has a moment in their life when they're growing up from kids to adulthood, when they start to realize that, like, their parents they're more human than you realized. You have them as this sort of mythological thing almost, who are infallible and, obviously operated with the best of ethics at all times. And I think in a similar way, the medical field to me was always kind of a mystery, where, doctors are largely infallible and they're always making the right decisions, and they have all of the information that they need available to them to make that decision. That was a real surprise to see how much uncertainty there was in certain aspects of care. I think there are some situations that are very clear cut, but once you start delving into, 1 in 5,000 type stuff, you have to really advocate against folks who want to be dismissive of these challenges. And that's hard. That's a hard place to sit, to have a doctor say, well, I don't think it's a big deal, and to be like, but it is, because you don't have the medical background to do that. And I think people are certainly on the medical side wary that, you've run off and Googled a bunch of things, and now here you are, an armchair expert. That's not what we're doing at all. I think it's more an issue of, we have a good grasp of what our son's normal looks like. And anytime we're kind of out of that, that boundary, we're trying to sort of raise a flag about it and draw attention to it. But it is tough. I mean, we would take him to ER kind of like walk-in type emergency places and have to spend the first 10 minutes explaining all the historical context about why they were there and why this UTI is a problem, like why it shouldn't just be ignored. Because his original urologist put a note in his file that said, yeah, this kid's bladder is just going to be colonized. Like, it's not a big deal. Just ignore it. And when we went to this other walk-in kind of medical clinic, because he had a fever and was throwing up, they said, well, yeah, he tested positive for a UTI, but this urologist says it's not a big deal. I'm like, well, you're going to have to ignore that guy, because he's not our urologist anymore. We're still finding, this is before we found a lung. We're looking for a new one, but he's terrible. You got to ignore that. She's like, well, it's in the notes. I'm like, ah. So ultimately we did convince them to do, to basically send off the urine to a lab so that we could get sensitivity testing, so that we could figure out what to treat it with, because, he was refluxing, and in that situation, the bacteria was getting back to the kidney, which was cause him harm if we didn't get that under control.
It's a great example of parents really knowing their child more than anyone, and knowing that when there's something wrong. And with the complexities of Vactal and ARM, it just, you soon become your own expert, don't you?
I mean, within reason, right? Yeah, I mean, we're fortunate that we're working with the folks whose studies, tend to be what you're going to find online. But even then, you can have discussions about, like, are we getting the outcome we'd hope for? Perhaps this is, one of the tougher cases, and what are we going to do about that? Like, we're now in uncharted medical territory. There is no playbook for this, because as far as we know, this is the only case you've ever had go this long. Like, so now what do we do? And that's been tricky. With the flushes and things, we've been having to kind of read between the lines as far as, like, the mixes and things that we use. They'll have a proposed formulation, and then based on his reactions, we'll try to, go back to them and then adjust that. But that does require us to be very diligent in keeping records about that. I know that's something Holly's been really good about. What was the ratio today? How did he seem to respond to it? Because the doctors aren't even doing that. They're not tracking it at that level of granularity. They'll come back and say, we'll try this other flush. Well, we already tried that one a couple weeks ago, remember? Oh yeah, I guess we did. Or you'll have the, hey, try this. I mean, in the last 3 years, we've had 2 prescriptions where the dose was off by a tenth. In one case, it was supposed to be 1 and it was 10. We were on this airplane with these like 2 or 3 massive syringes full of pink antibiotic, and a buddy of mine at work, his partner was a pharmacist, and so I said, hey, like, this is the prescription that we got, like, is that normal? And he's like, that is literally, like, you can't go any higher for that body mass, like, that is ridiculous. He's like, and I'm not sure with 1 kidney that's a good idea. And so that we went back to the doctor's office. We'd only given him one dose or whatever, and they were like, oh yeah, that is a little bit high, yeah, let's dial that back. And then when I saw the math for like how they dialed it back, I was like, whoa, like, guys, we are very vulnerable to that kind of thing, because I don't have the pharmacological textbooks sitting around. We've had the enema formulation come back and they're like, use 25 glycerin, and we're like, you mean like 2.5 or whatever it is. That's not the exact scenario, but stuff like that, we're like, oh yeah, good catch. And I'm like, it's tough as a parent to have to think that you've got to make those catches.
It's like you have to be alert at all times, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a certain level of vigilance that comes with it, and that is tough. I think that having, we have these centers of excellence where they try to have more integrated care, at least here in the States, by bringing the practitioners together, and I think that that's really good. I can't imagine what it's like when folks don't have that opportunity, because I think that's going to really complicate things. Even with the sort of integrated care, there's some rough edges, but again, not having anything to compare with it, I think that judging based on our son day to day, I think that the overall outcomes have been pretty good.
One of the great things that has happened in the last 10, 20 years in our community has been the multidisciplinary models in America, especially like with Columbus, Cincinnati, yep, Colorado, Boston, Kansas. Like, there's many of them now that are, and they're all sort of like based on a similar model. Unfortunately, that's not all the case in other parts of the world.
Right.
We've seen examples of, there's a lot of families in the States that haven't got the means or the insurance cover to actually even get to one of those multidisciplinary centres, which is just, I know there's a frustration in a lot of families that they hear about the centres and they'd love to get there, but they just can't. And, your story is an example of you get to the right specialists in the centres, and it can help the child's life so much, can't it?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, we've been very privileged in that respect.
If I was to ask the question to you, what would your advice be to a father whose child has just been born with similar issues to your son now? What would your best advice be to him?
I guess it would be that you're going to have to be patient, and that's really hard. I think a lot of people have this characteristic, but I think some dads may have it more than others, where you see problems and you want to fix them. This is not one of those where you can just take any particular action and make it go away. So being really patient and expecting that these things take years to be resolved. The other thing is that, and this isn't unique to Vactrol, but when kids are born with complex medical challenges, it can be very isolating. And the CEO at the company I was at had a son who had more neurological issues, but I remember him taking me aside and saying, like, this is an extremely isolating experience, and you need to remember that there are folks out there that can help with that, and not to try to take it all on yourself emotionally. And so, I've had some friends and some peers who were very proactive in reaching out, trying to engage with me. Sometimes it's tough because they're like, hey, how'd the surgery go, or how'd this go? And maybe that one didn't go as well as I had hoped. Or, you had 3 ostomy bag blowouts that day and you're feeling really frustrated. And so I would get frustrated because I didn't feel like I could convey, where the pain points were. But most of them, stuck with it. And after a while, I was able to kind of to reach out more and feel more comfortable sharing more about what was going on. That was something I struggled with, was how much I wanted to talk about it.
Is that because of the perceived stigma of the condition, or you just weren't confident in how you could express it?
I mean, I think part of it was, I deal in a world where information is really powerful, and I didn't want necessarily to tell my own son's story before he had the opportunity to do so himself. I mean, I think that part of the reason this discussion is a little different from that is obviously because there are a lot of parents out there who are going on this journey, and I didn't have a podcast like this or anything to kind of look to. I think that would have been really helpful. Having a network there is obviously really powerful. I know for my wife, having the pull through network and other groups that she could reach out to has been invaluable. And for me, I haven't necessarily reached into those networks as much as I have just kind of the folks that I've already had in my life who are friends, to kind of lean on them.
Yep. And I suppose one of the issues that we do have in the social media communities and the support groups and all that is that the reality is 95% of them are mothers. There's not a lot of fathers that are on there, which is absolutely fine. How have you found, like, the mothers take on a lot of the burden? Right.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Right. And how have you found your role as a husband to Holly to support her through a lot of this? Because that gets brought up a lot with you talking to families and all that, the dynamic and how how the dad can support the mother.
Yeah, that's been really tough. Candidly, I think that we've been working, a lot more to communicate. At some points in the first couple of years of his life, the communication was when we were kind of switching child management responsibilities for the day. So, be, okay, you're going to take him for a couple hours. This is what I got out of the cath. This is what this was like. This was these data points. And so you just have a series of metrics that you were conveying to one another, almost like you were changing watch at some kind of, air traffic controllers or something. And we really weren't operating in kind of a relationship at that point. That's obviously not representative of every day, but there was, that was thematically, I think, accurate at different points. And we had to, be a little bit more diligent about focusing on us and communicating more about hopes and fears and aspirations, both, as a family and what was going on with his care, because it does dominate a lot of the conversation. I think that's natural, but sometimes I have to pump the brakes and be like, look, we can't solve this today. Like, we can talk about this issue till we turn blue, but ultimately we've got to wait for, specialist, whomever, to reach back with inputs. And so while we're waiting, let's talk about this other thing, or let's redirect a little bit, because you got to pace yourself to some extent. The world is all about getting people spun up and sprinting all the time for all the things. And so it's tricky sometimes to make sure that your own family's situation, medical needs, and others don't follow that same path.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you being so candid. I believe it's such an important issue that probably doesn't get discussed as much as it should be because of the topic it is. It's all encompassing, and having to support each other as parents is so important because it makes so much difference to the child.
Yeah, I think that the next thing that I'm looking towards is understanding how we'll prepare him to deal with the social aspects of growing up. He presents as very typical, and so you wouldn't necessarily expect that he's got these different challenges. And so and that there's nothing wrong with that, but I don't know how 4-year-olds will react to it. I don't know how we'll explain it to them, how we'll explain it to him. One of the things that I heard early on when we were seeing specialists was that some kids obviously really struggle with depression and anxiety, which a lot of kids do anyway, right? And without any complicating factors. And so we've tried to seek out specialists who can help us both help the parents and help him as he grows manage some of these conversations, because I do think that they're going to come up, and to the extent that we can, we want to be prepared to have those conversations with him. I know that there's going to be kids that are going to tease or be mean at some point. I think that's inevitable. And so having a strategy around how to handle that, I think, is going to be really important. Now, I could be wrong, right? And that would be great, but that's not really how we approach things these days.
Yeah, well, you sort of like alluded to it earlier when you said he came home and he was talking about the little girl who was congratulated about going to the potty, haven't you? So it's sort of like, I'd imagine that then stirs those thoughts up.
Yeah, there was another little girl in the neighborhood who's 5 or 6, and she was like, "Why is he still in diapers?" And I was like, "What's wrong with being in diapers?" And she was like, "I don't know," and walked away. Yeah, I mean, depending on how his different regimens for the colorectal stuff work out, I don't know what that's going to look like. And so I do feel a little bit protective of that, and not kind of knowing where that line is in terms of being overreactive.
Yep.
Versus just recognizing that kids are going to be curious and kids are going to have questions, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? That's an opportunity for dialogue, and so we'll see.
In the immediate future, is there anything upcoming as far as any medical procedures it has to be done, or what's the current status?
There are no surgeries on the books. I have a feeling we're not done, but the waters are quiet right now as far as that's concerned. And so from my perspective, not going to try to rock the boat, at least until this next wave, at least here in the States, of the pandemic kind of sorts itself out, and kind of then refocus on, okay, are these flushes going as well as we hope? Do we need to do another imaging study? Where do we need to go for that? When do we do that? And start, working through those challenges.
Yep. Well, Mark, look, I can't thank you enough for what you've shared with us today. There's going to be so many fathers out there who I believe you're going to have such an impact on by opening up and being so candid, and mothers as well. It might open a conversation with their partners that they feel they might need to have. So, mate, I can't thank you enough. And Eastern Sky is one very fortunate little fella to have you and Holly as his parents. So once again, mate, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's no problem, Greg. I think he's made a tremendous difference in our lives as well. It's opened our eyes to a lot of things, and I think it's really helped us grow as people. So we're very proud of him. And last thing I would say to any parents listening, a lot of these kids are going to be able to go and have the kinds of lives that I think that we hope for them. And there's a lot of effort between that young state and that adult state, but I think that's something to kind of keep in the back of their minds, is that they can get there, even if it's a bit of a slog.
Great advice, Mark. So once again, Mark, thanks so much for being a part of our podcast, and I wish you, Holly, and Eastern Sky all the best, mate.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.